Spiritual Theology, Part 22. Duties of a spiritual director. We have already mentioned that the function of the confessor and that of the spiritual director are not the same, although spiritual direction is frequently given in the confessional. The following seems to us to be the principal duties of a spiritual director. 1. To know the soul that is directed. The director should have a profound knowledge of the person he is to direct character, temperament, good and evil inclinations, defects, likes and dislikes, power and energy. He should have a knowledge of the individual's past life, at least along general lines, so that he will know the principal temptations to which the soul is subjected, means used to overcome those temptations, the grace received from God, the progress in virtue by what that means, the individual's present dispositions, the intensity of the desire to strive for perfection, the sacrifices the individual is willing to make in order to attain sanctity, and the obstacles and difficulties at the present time. Nothing should be put in writing, either by the director or the one directed. It is easy for a penitent to imagine that such written accounts one day rank with the autobiographies of certain saints, and there is always the possibility that they may fall into the hands of the wrong persons. Moreover, it is usually difficult to judge accurately a written document of one's own personal experiences. Hence, all information given to the director should be given orally. Unlike the confessor, who should normally believe whatever the penitent declares in the confessional, the spiritual director is not obliged to believe everything that he hears. Indeed, there are occasions when he should examine and question the person before making any decision. 2. To give instruction. The spiritual director is expected to instruct the person under his guidance, thus making it possible for the individual to solve his or her own problems and difficulties whenever possible. Spiritual direction has as its goal the perfection of the individual, and the ideal is to enable the individual to walk or even to fly to the summit of sanctity. Like any form of counseling, spiritual direction should be given only when necessary. If the director dominates the individual excessively and makes that person come to him for decisions or permissions in unnecessary and sometimes foolish things, the subject becomes increasingly weaker and more dependent on the director. It is not unusual to find spiritual directors who violate this basic rule and nullify any good they could accomplish by making themselves the focal point of all direction. The only exception would be in dealing with souls who are scrupulous or excessively curious, because such persons, the only method of treatment is to exact unquestioning obedience. The instructions given by the director should avoid all controversial points in the theology of Christian perfection, all abstruse and disputed questions in speculative theology, and in general anything that would serve to sharpen the curiosity of the person directed without giving an understanding of the special matters. His instructions should be based on those fundamental points, commonly accepted by all theologians, rather than a particular devotion or spiritual exercise, which may be perfectly orthodox and commendable in itself, but not suited to the taste or present need of the person directed. He will, above all, avoid any word or action that could be interpreted as disapproval or disdain for any other school of spirituality. 3. To encourage the soul. Few souls, even among those who are advanced, are so self-sufficient that they do not need to be encouraged. The spiritual director is not only called upon to give instructions and to solve difficulties, but also required to be a true educator who makes a positive contribution to the spiritual formation of the soul under his direction. Sometimes the best possible way of contributing to this formation is by means of encouragement and simulation. To that end, the director should endeavor to infuse in souls a healthy optimism founded on confidence in God and distrust of self. Souls must be made to realize that they are individually called to perfection, and that they can attain if they are faithful to the graces of God gives them. If they fail or become discouraged, the director should lift them up and make them see that discouragement at their failure can be more harmful to their spiritual life than the feature itself. It would be impossible to measure the harm that is done by souls by severe and harsh treatment from the director of the precise moment when disheartened individuals need assistance and confidence and encouragement to resume the difficult journey towards perfection. Frequently there is nothing that so animates a soul as to be received with kindness and understanding when it is expected to be censured and scolded by the director. 4. To control the spiritual life of the person directed. The soul should not take any important step without the approval of the spiritual director. The plan of life, the method of prayer, practices of piety, the practice of mortification, the work of the apostolate, the material of the examination of conscience. But the direction should be limited strictly to those things that concern the soul's growth in holiness. The spiritual director should take care that he does not become an intolerable burden to the person directed by interjecting his authority into those matters that are of petty consequence and are not related to the spiritual life. By the same token, he should never allow the penitent to insert family matters, business affairs, or human preoccupations into the interviews or conferences. As soon as he perceives that the person is beginning to wander from the matter that pertains to the spiritual life, he should immediately and definitely put an end to such discussion. In order to prevent any such digression, the spiritual director should always be in control of the conversation and should insist that all matters be discussed as briefly and as directly as possible. If from the very start of the spiritual direction he restricts the individual to a succinct discussion of the matter at hand, he will avoid wasting much precious time and will prevent the direction from degenerating into pious conversation or purely social visits. 5. To correct defects. The spiritual director will have to know how to unite the sweetness of character and the obligation of correcting the fault of the person directed. Although the purpose of a spiritual direction is eminently positive to lead the soul to the height of perfection, he cannot achieve that goal without the negative aspect of uprooting defects. It does not suffice for the director to be concerned simply with the correction of voluntary faults. He must likewise understand and seek to remedy the dispositions to sin that are found in the individual person. Thus the precipitation, inconstancy, superficiality, and sensuality, which predispose to various sins, must be corrected so that the personality can be integrated and properly disposed for the practice of virtue. As regards voluntary faults, the spiritual director will never allow the individual to excuse himself for his fall by blaming them on the temperament of some external circumstance. The particular examen will be utilized as a means of discovering the occasions that provided the temptation and the causes that disposed for the deliberate fault. Although he must avoid discouraging the individual, the director must make the subject realize that voluntary imperfections are incompatible with the perfection of charity. 6. To direct by progressive stages. Spiritual direction should be progressive and accommodated to the soul's degree of virtue, temperament, age, and circumstances of life. If the direction given as far as needs and the capacities of the soul will become disheartened and discouraged because more will be demanded of it than it is capable of doing. If, on the other hand, the soul has advanced beyond a type of direction that is given, the wings of the soul will be tied so that it cannot soar to God. The director must, therefore, discern what are the needs of the soul at a given time, and then take care that the direction given will satisfy those needs. When he wishes to intensify the spiritual life of the soul, he may propose things by way of trial or test, in order to see how the soul relax. He needs not to and should not tell the soul that this is his method, but he should take every precaution not to hold back the soul when God wishes to lead it to a higher stage, and not force the soul to a higher stage when it is not yet ready to make the step. Growth in the spiritual life, like any other kind of growth, must be gradual and continuous. Consequently, the spiritual director should know the various steps that mark the phases of growth, from the beginning of the ascetical life to the transforming union. And in dealing with these particular individuals, he should expect that they will not remain static in any given phase, but that they will progress in gradual stages from one phase of the spiritual life to another. And although it is true that God could take a soul in his arms, so to speak, and carry it from one stage of life to a much higher stage, this is not to be presumed in any given text, because it is the ordinary working of God's grace. 7. To observe secrecy. The spiritual director is obliged to observe absolute secrecy in regard to the confidences that he has received from the persons he directs, not only because of the many things are in some way connected with the internal forum, it is also because the office of spiritual director obligates him to natural secrecy. The obligation to secrecy is especially important when it is a question of advanced souls who have experienced certain extraordinary phenomena and supernatural cherisms. Although a director who comes into contact with such phenomena may have a strong inclination to discuss these things, he should remember that, as a rule, the narration of such things does nothing more than arouse the morbid curiosity in others and dispose the director himself to feelings of pride and self-complacency. The person directed. Since spiritual direction involves two persons, the success of the direction is not guaranteed by the mere fact that the director possesses all the necessary qualities and understands the purpose and function of spiritual direction. There are also definite requisites demanded of the soul that receives the spiritual direction, and that these requisites flow, first of all, from the nature of spiritual direction itself, and, secondly, from the relationship of the person directed with the spiritual director. The direction itself cannot be successful unless the person directed possesses the following qualities. Sincerity. This is the first and most important quality because without it any kind of direction is impossible. The spiritual director has to know all temptations and weaknesses and desires and resolutions, good and evil inclinations, difficulties and trials, successes and failures. If he is to guide the soul to greater perfection, his hands are tied unless he has sufficient knowledge of the soul. Although the spiritual director need not also be a confessor, it would be impossible to give any spiritual direction if the director were to know nothing of the sins and the imperfections of the individual. One should reveal to the director whatever has any importance in regard to the spiritual life, but it is not necessary, and it would even be an abuse, to give him a detailed account of petty trifles and insignificant events. But what is revealed should be revealed with all frankness and sincerity, without condoning or excusing one's failures or exaggerating one's virtues. 2. Obedience. The director does not possess any authority by which he can demand strict obedience. Spiritual direction is a matter of perfect liberty on the part of the director and the two directed. By the very fact that a person seeks the help of the director, however, the two are not on equal footing. The director is in a position of superiority as master and guide. Granted the voluntary submission of a person to the director has a right to expect docility and obedience from the one directed. If these are lacking, there can be no spiritual direction. The soul should simply obey, and without discussions or personal interpretations. It should be noted that even worse than disobedience is the duplicity by which a soul would so ingratiate himself with the director that he would command it to do only things the soul wants to do. This does not mean, however, that an individual may not take initiative in order that the manifestation of conscience, or to the point of particular difficulties or obstacles that the director perhaps did not see. What is to be thought of the vow of obedience that some persons have taken to their spiritual director? In general, this is not advisable because of the disadvantages neglected or connected with it, such as too much responsibility for the director, anxiety for the person directed, too much passivity in unnecessary visits and interviews. In any case, the director should never take the initiative and suggest that a person make a vow of obedience to him, for this would be an abuse of his authority and his office. It would be an even greater abuse if a director were to add to the vow of obedience the promise never to change directors or never to consult anyone else. But if an individual voluntarily and repeatedly requests permission to make a vow of obedience to the director for an increase of merit, it could be permitted under the following circumstances: that the vow to be made for a short period of time and renewed if desired, that the person making the vow be perfectly normal, serene, and balanced, and c. that the vow may be revoked if any difficulties or anxieties arise. What is to be done if a conflict arises between the commands of a lawful superior and those of a spiritual director? One must unhesitatingly obey the superior, even if one has taken a vow of obedience to the director. It should be noted that private vows taken by religious are null and void without the approval of their superiors. And even if one has received permission of a religious superior to make a vow of obedience to one's director, the superior never loses the power over the subject that is the result of religious profession. 3. Perseverance. The very nature of a spiritual direction requires that the person directed should persevere in seeking the help and guidance of the director. Spiritual direction is rendered sterile by the frequent change of directors, by absenting oneself for long periods, by the constant change of spiritual exercises and means of satisfaction, or letting oneself be led by a caprice of the moment instead of following the instructions received from the director. When serious reasons justify a change, a person should not hesitate to find a new director, but that it is something quite distinct from the fickleness and inconstancy manifested by some persons in changing from one director to another under the slightest pretext. 4. Discretion. The person receiving spiritual directions should never forget that, if the director is obliged to the seal of confession or to natural secrecy, one receiving direction is obliged to observe silence concerning the director. As a general rule, a person should never reveal to others the particular admonitions or counsels retrieved from the spiritual director. Such advice is given to a particular person in view of particular circumstances and does not apply to other persons living in different circumstances. Many directors have suffered greatly as the result of the indiscretion of their penitents, and this is sufficient reason for a director to refuse to continue the direction of such a person. The principal qualities required of the person directed in relation to the director are respect, confidence, and supernatural love. Respect. The person directed should see in the director not merely a man gifted with certain qualities, but the representative of God and Christ. No matter what defects or perfections he may have in natural order, the director must be regarded with respect precisely as a director and a guide of the spiritual office. This profound respect will be most useful not only in fostering the docility and obedience of the person directed, but also in serving as a brake to any excessive attachment, or the sensual affection for the director. 2. Confidence. In addition to respect, there should be absolute confidence in the director. It should be a confidence that is truly filial, and so absolute that no one can always be perfectly natural and frank when dealing with the director. If the person directed is timid and self-conscious, the spiritual direction will never be completely efficacious. 3. Supernatural love. Once a person has cultivated a filial confidence towards the director, it frequently happens that true love develops for the director. This is one of the most delicate problems in the relationship between the spiritual director and the person directed. There is nothing unlawful about a love for one's spiritual director, so long as the love remains on a supernatural level. The lives of the saints give countless examples of this type of holy love. The difficulty lies in keeping the love on a purely supernatural level. It is not at all likely that, in many circumstances, the love of a woman for her spiritual director is pretty natural, proceeding from the normal affinity that exists between a woman and a man. The love could also be the result of the paternal interest and affection manifested by the director and a sense of gratitude for all he has done for the individual. The danger that lies in the love of friendship between a director and a woman is augmented by the fact that the director necessarily must know about matters of conscience, temptations, even sins. Even if a director is convinced that there is no danger to himself or his penitents, he must always be conscious of the danger of scandal to others. As a consequence of all this, the person directed should make every effort to see the director as another Christ, to confer with him only when necessary, and scrupulously to avoid any manifestation of human affection. In such matters, the director must have a most delicate conscience and a refined prudence, without going to the extreme of being excessively timid, suspicious, or gruff. If it is a question of mutable sensible affection, recognized by both parties, it would be more prudent for the individual to seek another spiritual director. The reason for this is not only the obvious danger that such a friendship may easily degenerate into sensual affection, but that under those conditions it would be difficult to have true and efficacious spiritual direction. If the director experiences a sensible affection for the person directed, he should examine it before God in order to discover whether such an affection disturbs his spirit, places him in danger of temptation, impedes the liberty he should have had as a spiritual director, or is the source of some other danger. In this case, without revealing his feelings to the person directed, he should find some reasonable cause for abandoning the direction. If, in spite of the sensible affection, he does not experience any longer of temptations or any obstacle to the direction, he may proceed with the direction, but always keeping a prudent vigilance over himself. If, finally, the director realizes that his penitent has developed a sensible affection for him, and he does not return that affection, he should examine whether or not such an affection is disturbing the person's peace of soul or provoking temptation. If so, he should advise and even command that the individual seek another spiritual director. If there is no danger that the affection of the penitent may generate into sensual love, he may continue the direction of that individual, but he should be very careful, lest by some imprudent word or act he should augment that human affection. Selection of a spiritual director. Some persons, for example, cloistered nuns or persons who do not have access to several priests, are not in a position to choose their own director. In such cases, one must do as well as possible with the person available and supply for any deficiencies by consulting books. Apart from these particular cases, the choice of a spiritual director should be made in the following way. The first thing to be done is to ask in prayer for the grace and light to proceed prudently in this important matter. Then one should investigate who among the available priests possess the prudence, experience, and learning necessary for a good director. Under no circumstances should the choice be made because of one's natural inclination towards a particular priest, although it should be recognized that it would be far more difficult to open one's heart with confidence to a priest for whom one feels repugnant or antipathy. It is not advisable to ask the priest immediately to be his spiritual director, but one should test him for a time to see whether or not he would be able to fulfill the task of director. It may sometimes be necessary to find a different spiritual director, although one should readily believe that the necessary to change directors. The reasons that are sufficiently serious for changing one's spiritual director can be listed under two heads: if the direction has become useless or harmful. Spiritual direction becomes useless when, in spite of one's good will and sincere desire to advance in holiness, one does not feel toward the director the respect, confidence, and frankness that are indispensable for the efficacy of the spiritual direction. It would also be a futile effort if one perceives that the director never makes connections to one's defects, nor or does not encourage progress in virtue, does not solve problems, and shows no immediate interest in the sanctification of the individual. The direction would be harmful if the person directed discovers that the director feeds the vanity and complacency of the individual, readily tolerates one's faults and imperfections, or judges things from point of view that is too natural. Or in the director wastes time by frivolous conversations, by asking questions out of simple curiosity, or in discussing matters not related to growth and holiness. Or when one perceives that there has developed a strong sensible affection on the part of one or both, when the director imposes obligations that are beyond one's strength or incompatible with the duties of one's state in life, or when one perceives clearly that the advice given has been harmful instead of helpful. Should be noted, however, that one may easily be mistaken in the making judgments concerning the complacence of the director and the efficacy of the Spirit, and for that reason it is imperative that one deliberate before making a change in spiritual directors. Would it be fitting to have several directors at the same time? Although there have been cases in which a person had several spiritual directors, in general it is not prudent to do so. There is always the danger of a difference of opinion and a conflict as a result of discrepancy in the advice given. As we have already stated, the director himself, if he is prudent and humble, will take the initiative and advise the penitent to consult another person. But apart from these special cases, the unity of spiritual direction must always be preserved, especially when dealing with scrupulous persons, and this unity is best preserved by having one director. Spiritual direction by correspondence. The last question to be answered in the matter of spiritual direction concerns direction given by mail. If it is a question of an isolated case in which the individual requests advice or the solution of a problem by mail, there would be no reason why such direction should not be given in a letter, if one observes the necessary precautions required whenever confidential matters are discussed by letter. If advice is requested by persons who already have their own spiritual director, great caution should be observed, especially if one is not sure of the good faith and discretion of the person who is taking advice. Sometimes individuals seek an answer in writing from another priest in order to show this letter to their own director and confront him with advice that is contrary to what he has given. If it is necessary for one priest to correct the advice given by another priest, this should be given as an amplification and further application of the advice already given, rather than a complete and total rectification. Now, but what is to be said of spiritual direction given entirely by mail? It may happen in exceptional cases, but it is the only way in which a person can receive spiritual direction. Or even apart from these cases, there are examples of direction by mail in the lives of the saints. For example, St. Francis de Sales and St. Paul of the Cross. But the disadvantages far outnumber the advantages of spiritual direction by letter. It is morally impossible for the director to acquire an intimate knowledge of the person directed unless there is an communication between them. It is very difficult to express or describe one's interior life in writing. It is equally difficult to understand another person from a written account. Moreover, the spiritual director is not able to make corrections immediately, as he could do if the person were actually speaking to him. Another disadvantage is that letters may fall easily into the hands of others. In practice, the spiritual director should not be willing to accept the direction of a soul through correspondence unless he already knows the individual and the person has no other recourse. In the actual writing of letters, the director should never write a single line that would in any way constitute a violation of the seal of confession. If he receives such material in letters from the person directed, he should destroy the letter as soon as possible as he read it, and should severely forbid the individual from writing such things in the future, under penalty of discontinuing the spiritual direction. Whatever direction is given in writing should be brief and objective. The spiritual director should scrupulously avoid any terms of affection, pet names, excessive cordial salutations, and anything that smacks of sentimentality. Those who have had experiences in spiritual direction by mail have been most succinct in their answers, sometimes writing a few words on the letter itself and returning it to the sender without any signature. If in some cases it is necessary to write at greater length, the director should confine himself to problems or questions presented to the instruction, exhortation, or correction the matter demands. He should observe the greatest prudence and delicacy, and should always remember that, in spite of his own goodwill, there is always the danger of false interpretations and rash judgments. He should observe the greatest prudence and delicacy. His letters should always be such that he never has anything to fear in this respect. Lastly, both he and the person directed must avoid any kind of secret or clandestine correspondence. Discernment of spirits. 14. It is indispensable for the direction of souls and for the study of extraordinary mystical phenomena to be able to distinguish the various spirits under which an individual may act or be acted upon. As used here, the word spirit refers to two different types of motivating factors or powers. The spirit of an individual refers to the internal inclination to good or evil, and it manifests itself with such regularity that it must be considered a personal trait. Thus, if a person has a propensity to prayer, he or she is said to possess the spirit of prayer. If there is a tendency to arguments and altercations, he or she is said to possess a spirit of contradiction, etc. Under this sense, the spirit of a person usually the result of both temperament and character. It is extremely rare, even among the saints, but when it occurs it is infallible because it is the result of an anterior movement or inspiration received from the Holy Spirit, who cannot err. Acquired discernment is absolutely necessary for a spiritual director. St. John of the Cross places great stress on the importance of discernment, pointing out that the priest who presumes to take charge of the direction of souls without such knowledge is guilty of temerity. It is therefore important to examine the various means by which one can acquire the art of discernment of spirits. 1. Prayer. This is the most important and fundamental means. Although we are speaking of an acquired art, the personal effort would avail nothing without the special assistance of the Holy Spirit through the virtue of prudence and the gift of counsel. Hence, it is not only a question of the constant practice of prayer, but the particular petition which the director requests of God, the prudence necessary for the direction of the souls, and the light to be able to discern the will of God for some particular soul at a given time. It does not suffice to possess a theoretical knowledge of the spiritual life and the ways to perfection. One needs to know the practical and concrete application of these principles in particular cases. It is certain that God will answer these prayers with special graces that he gives to all rightly disposed souls so that they may fulfill their duties. 2. Study. The spiritual director likewise needs a vast amount of knowledge acquired through study. He should be familiar with the general principles of spiritual theology contained in sacred scripture, speculative theology, the masters of the spiritual life, and the lives of the saints. He would be especially careful. 3. Personal experience. Self-knowledge is a basic requirement for the kind of direction of others. While it is true that each person has unique traits and characteristics, there is also a common pattern possessed by all, and unless one understands oneself, it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to understand others. Under this same heading we may include that sympathy or rapport that enables the director to place himself in the position and circumstances in which the others find themselves. According to the statement of St. Paul, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Moreover, if the spiritual director himself has not attained some degree of virtue and self-mastery, it is not likely that he will be able to understand their condition, especially when they enter upon the higher states of the spiritual life. Holiness of life is of inestimable value in acquiring the art of discernment of spirits. (4) Removal of obstacles. Under this heading, we may place all the defective qualities that are an impediment to the understanding and direction of souls. One of the greatest obstacles in the spirit of self-sufficiency, which prevents the director from seeking the advice of those who are more learned and more experienced than himself. Secondly, the director must avoid at all costs an excessive attachment to the one he is directing, for this attachment will cloud his judgment and cause him to be too sympathetic. He must strive to be as objective as possible and avoid the inclination to judge others according to purely human standards. He will never be precipitous in his decisions, but will subject them to mature reflection. Types of spirits. Spirits can be summarized under three headings: the divine spirit, the diabolical spirit, and the human spirit. God always inclines us to the good, working either directly or through secondary causes. The devil always inclines us to evil, working by his own power and through the allurements of the things of the world. The human spirit may be inclined to evil or to good, depending upon whether the individual follows right reason or selfish desires. Due to the basic indifference of many purely natural inclinations, it is evident that they may be used for good and for evil. And while grace does not destroy the nature, but perfects and supernaturalizes it, if the devil utilizes human weakness and the effects of original sin to infuse his evil aims. Moreover, it may happen that, in one and the same inclination or action, various spirits are intermingled, making it difficult to discern which spirit has the predominance at a given time. The Spirit of God and the spirit of the devil cannot be operating at the same time, since they tend to oppose goals, but God can direct or intensify a naturally good inclination, or the devil may divert those inclinations to evil. And even when the divine spirit predominates in a given action, it does not follow that all antecedent or consequent movements and inclinations are likewise divine and supernatural. It frequently happens that purely human and natural movements introduce themselves, consciously or unconsciously, because they cause the action to lose some of its supernatural purity. This is one of the factors making it almost impossible for a director or theologian to discern clearly the divine element of extraordinary mystical phenomenon. Moreover, it is not at all unusual in the lives of mystics that their mystical and truly supernatural operations are interrupted by purely natural activities, or that, with God's permission, a diabolical influence is introduced. It is not easy to determine when the actions of God terminates and when the natural or diabolical movement begins. If the director is familiar with the signs of the various spirits, however, he will have sufficient grounds for making a prudent judgment in each case. It will not always be a situation in which one spirit is operating exclusively, but if there is a mixture of several spirits, one way or another will always predominate. The divine spirit. The following characteristics are general signs of the divine spirit. Truth. God is truth, and cannot inspire anything but truth in a soul. If a person believes to be inspired by God, therefore maintains opinions that are manifestly against revealed truth, the infallible teaching of the Church, or the proven theology and philosophy or science, it must be concluded that the individual is deluded by the devil, or is the victim of excessive imagination or faulty reasoning. 2. Gravity. God is never the cause of things that are useless, futile, frivolous, or impertinent. When his spirit moves, a soul is always something serious or beneficial. 3. Enlightenment. Although one may not always understand the meaning of an inspiration from God, the effect of any divine movement or impulse is always enlightenment and certitude, rather than darkness and confusion. This is true both on the effects of the individual who receives the inspiration of its effects on others. 4. Docility. Souls that are moved by the Spirit of God accept cheerfully the advice and counsel of their directors, or others who have authority over them. This spirit of obedience, docility, and submission is one of the clearest signs that a particular inspiration or movement is from God. This is especially true in the case of the educated, who have a greater tendency to be attached to their own opinions. 5. Discretion. The Spirit of God makes the soul discreet, prudent, and thoughtful in all its actions. There is nothing of precipitation, lightness, exaggeration, or impetuosity. All is well balanced, edifying, serious, and full of calmness and peace. 6. Humility. The Holy Spirit is always filled with the soul with sentiments of humility and self-effacement. The loftier the communications from on high, the more profoundly the soul declines to the abyss of its own nothingness. Mary said, "I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be done to me as you say." 7. Peace. St. Paul speaks frequently of the peace that comes from God. Romans 15:33, Philippians 4:9. And Jesus mentions peace as one of the manifestations of his Spirit. John 14:27. This is a quality that always accompanies communications from God. The soul experiences a profound and stable serenity in the depths of the Spirit. 8. Confidence in God. This is a counterpart and the necessary consequence of true humility. Recognizing that of itself it can do nothing, as St. Paul says, the soul throws itself on the power and mercy of God with a childlike trust. Then it learns that it can do all things in him. Philippians 4:13. 9. Flexibility of will. This sign consists primarily in a certain promptness of the will to subject itself to the inspirations and invitations of God. Secondarily, it consists in a facility in following the advice and counsel of others, especially if they are superiors, confessors, or spiritual directors. It is opposed to the rigid and unyielding will that is characteristic of those who are filled with self-love. 10. Purity of intention. The soul seeks only the glory of God in all that it does and the perfect fulfillment of the will of God. without human interests or motivation out of self-love. 11. Patience in suffering. Suffering is frequently the best touchstone for revealing the true worth of an individual. No matter what the source of the suffering, whether it is justly received or not, the soul bears it with patience and equanimity and uses it as a means of further perfection. 12. Self-abnegation. The words of Christ himself are sufficient evidence that this is a sign of the Spirit of God. If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me. Matthew 16:24. 13. Simplicity. Together with veracity and sincerity, this characteristic is never lacking in those who are truly motivated by the Spirit of God. Any duplicity, arrogance, hypocrisy, or vanity must be attributed rather to the spirit of the devil, the father of lies. 14. Liberty of spirit. First of all, there is no attachment to any created thing, not even to the gifts received from God. Second, all is accepted from the hands of God with gratitude and humility, whether it be a serious question or consolation or trial. Third, while all duties and spiritual exercises are performed with promptness and punctuality, the soul is ready to leave even the most consoling and profitable exercise as soon as the charity of God calls it elsewhere. The liberty of spirit enables the soul to live in a state of constant joy and eagerness for the things of God. 15. Desire to imitate Christ. St. Paul says that it is impossible to have the Spirit of God without having the Spirit of Christ. Romans 8:9. For that reason, St. John of the Cross states that the soul that aspires to perfection must have a desire to imitate Christ in all things by conforming its life as much as possible to his. 16. Disinterested love. We mean by this kind of love all the characteristics St. Paul attributed to true charity. 1 Corinthians 13:4-7.